Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Yeah, lovely. Okay.
Yep.
So yeah, as Anna said, I'm James Godsell. I'm Director of Employer Partnerships for RNN Group. We're a collection of 3 colleges, North Notts College based in Worksop, Rotherham College based obviously in Rotherham, and Dearne Valley College based in Dearne Valley. We operate engineering apprenticeships out of our North Notts College site, and we also operate them out of our Rotherham site. And for the first time last year, we actually gave our level 3 students that were studying an apprenticeship the opportunity to go to the National Fluid Power Centre to learn all about integrated systems engineering as well. So National Fluid Power Centre are also a part of the RNN Group. So we've got a really broad range of different things that we offer for engineers. But specifically today, I'm going to talk about the apprenticeships, the reforms that took place. We're now about 2.5 years into the reforms. So it's interesting to see kind of how they've progressed. If I move my slide on. So the kind of 2 things I wanted to talk about initially are 2 reports that were published. One being the Wolf Report in 2011 and the Richards Review of 2012, which might seem a long time ago. But there were some key findings out of that kind of led to some significant reforms of the apprenticeships. The findings from both reports were that there was actually not a need for awarding body qualifications. Now, I'm not sure if anyone can remember Train to Gain as it was, but Train to Gain was very much a sheep dip approach to training. So people were being trained and the quality of the delivery was vastly different. They were all trained to a qualification, but it wasn't at the same standard. The other thing that the report suggested was an endpoint assessment. So actually reviewing somebody's skills and knowledge at the end of their program. Traditionally, when you do GCSEs or your A-levels or even degrees, you kind of go through and at the end you have an assessment, whether that's the form of an exam or coursework or something like that. With apprenticeships, you kind of naturally over the course of the program holistically generated evidence, and at the end you just submitted all of that evidence and you got your qualification. I suppose what that did is open it up to, I don't want to say abuse, but people could actually generate the evidence quite easily. The assessor could be quite heavily involved, and actually, you know, it's not your work, it's somebody else's, especially when you've got multiple apprentices having courses delivered at the same time. You know, there's lots of copying that could occur. So by having an endpoint assessment, it kind of takes that away. Somebody independent of the training provider will come in, review that learner. There'll potentially be a practical skills test. There'll absolutely be, you know, a multiple choice test or some form of written test. And there'll also be a portfolio discussion as well. So the learner is having to demonstrate their knowledge to somebody. And that kind of just eliminates any opportunity for that learner to have cheated this program. The other thing that they suggested was reduction and closure of all frameworks. So as a college or a group of colleges, we spent the last 2 years preparing for a variety of qualifications to be switched off. We moved over to the new apprenticeship standards, or the majority of them, last September. I think we've got a couple of the higher ones that we're just project managing at the moment, and they'll be ready for this September. But essentially, as of July this year, the goal is that all frameworks will be stopped. So with the COVID-19 situation, there has been rumours that they may extend the frameworks for slightly longer, but it's absolutely the government's intention that frameworks are on the way out and the apprenticeship standards will or have already replaced them. The other thing they wanted to do was create a tax on businesses over a specific size. That is the form of the Apprenticeship Levy. Some of you probably pay the Apprenticeship Levy, some of you won't. Those of you that don't will be expected to make a 5% contribution, although as of January, there is a non-levy digital account that you can access to draw funding down as well. The idea of it is it very much puts the employer in the driving seat. There was a feeling from both these reports that actually providers go in and tell employers what they can deliver, when actually it should be the employers telling the training provider what they want, and then the training provider delivers on what they want. So, and also the final thing is clear progression routes from technical and professional education. So what that means is there are T-levels coming out. Some of you will know more about T-levels than others, but essentially the T-levels should be able to run in parallel with an apprenticeship. So if I'm on a T-level and I go out and get work experience and that person likes me and wants to take me onto an apprenticeship, everything I've done to that point can be banked towards my apprenticeship, and then I'll just continue on my program on an apprenticeship. Equally, and if I start an apprenticeship and I get 6 months in and I realize actually I don't enjoy this and I want to go and do full-time, you could switch that program onto an FE program. So it allows kind of various jumping on and jumping off points. I think if I'm honest, FE's got a way to go for that to be a reality, but that's certainly the expectation from government. So there's a little bit on there about the levy. I want to just really briefly cover that because I'm sure most of you that are paying it will already understand it. Essentially, it's taken by HMRC, it's put into a digital account for you to access, and you use that training to procure apprenticeships. If you don't pay the apprenticeship levy, you will make a 5% contribution to the overall cost of the training to your training provider, and then they will claim the rest of the money off the government. As of January this year, as I mentioned, they are expecting more employers to start using their digital account, even if you don't pay the levy. And I think by October, I think it has changed slightly, they want everybody using the digital account. So you'll no longer be able to go to your provider and say, you know, you set up this training for me, I'll sign a couple of forms and that's it. As an SME employer, you will have to set up your own account. You will have to procure training in the same way levy payers do. You just don't have to make the same level of contribution. So brief slide on there about how it's worked. It's not really worked particularly well, certainly with the levy. I think what we found as a group of colleges is that a lot of employers have looked at existing staff training first, because if they're making an investment, you know, some of the qualifications are up to £26,000. I'm making a £26,000 investment in somebody. It wants to be somebody that I know is going to stick around. So what we found certainly in the first 2 years is that a lot of employers that are levy payers are haven't ramped up any additional apprenticeships than they would normally have taken on, but they've used their additional levy spend to increase existing staff. That's not the case for everybody, and we've certainly got some examples of some employers that have massively increased their entry-level apprenticeship recruitment as a result of the levy. But there are certainly a lot of employers that aren't doing that, that are looking at middle managers or senior managers, training them up in a departmental manager or a degree level qualification. And actually, that's not really what it was designed for. It was designed to increase the opportunities for 16 to 18-year-olds. So we spoke about all of those learners that are coming through from the guts and things like that. They're inspired. They want to have an opportunity to go on and work in that sector. So it really is on the sector to have those opportunities for the right people to be able to progress on. The other thing that I mentioned earlier was the endpoint assessment. So I've pulled up here the engineering technician as an example of the endpoint assessment. I think it's probably not overly typical because of the Viva, which I'll just come on to in a minute. But you can see on there, as an employer, your involvement is a lot more than it's been previously. So if I gave an example, if I was on a level 2 performing engineering operations apprenticeship and I progressed on to a level 3 engineering apprenticeship, you would see your assessor every 4 to 6 weeks. You'd probably get reports from college as to how they were performing there. As long as everything was going okay, there was not really too much need for you to get involved. And hopefully at the end, you've got a fully qualified person, because I understand the reality is you're going to do the majority of the training. You're the one that's going to show them how to use the machines. You're going to teach them a lot of the soft skills. So actually what the apprenticeship standard has done is actually recognize that involvement. So you can see on there, the employer will be involved in gateway assessments. So as they complete, in this one, you've got foundation knowledge and foundation competence, which is essentially the entry level part of the qualification. As an employer, you'll sit down with the provider and say, yeah, you know, I think they're at that right stage now, I want them to progress. Or you'll say, no, actually, I feel like they still need skills in X, Y, and Z. I want you to continue training them at that level. Reality is, you're probably going to go with whatever the provider says. However, you know, as an employer, you do have the power to say, no, I want to continue training. There's also a second gateway, and that's done right before the endpoint assessment. And at that point, we would be saying, okay, have they completed their qualifications? Do we feel we've got the right skills, knowledge, and behaviours demonstrated in a portfolio? And also, as an employer, do you feel like they are ready to finish their training, be assessed, and essentially at this point become a level 3 qualified engineer? The actual endpoint assessment itself will be a portfolio-based validation interview. And that will be undertaken by the employer. So they will ask questions of the apprentice. Obviously, you're going to get guidance from your provider on what that looks like. And actually, the apprentice themselves will be expected to kind of stand up and talk about themselves for a while as well. And if you consider that some of these apprentices may be 18, 19, I think of how I was when I was 18, 19. Would I feel confident standing up and recounting 4-year programs I've never met before for 30 minutes, 40 minutes? And it's quite a big ask. So what we've done, and I'm sure most providers will have done the same, is massively increase the communication skills that we teach as part of our program. Because it's all right having the technical skills, and that is very important, but you've got to be able to talk to somebody about it as well. So as an employer, I would be thinking, well, how can I make sure that this apprentice can talk about the skills that they've learned? You can't just rely on the provider. I think one of the things we suggest is that you get somebody else from your organisation, if you're big enough that maybe the apprentice doesn't know very well, get them to talk about their experience. It ideally wants to be someone that's technically minded, that can understand what they're saying. So if he was talking to me about it, I wouldn't have a clue, but it wants to be someone that can understand the technical knowledge that they've got, but it's just almost a sounding board for someone. We're also trying to create a lot more peer mentoring within our classrooms as well. So actually, if there's an apprentice that's doing really well, oftentimes they might get a bit bored, especially if they're learners that are maybe not at that level, that are having to be shown things several times. So one of the things we've started to do is get that apprentice to come and teach the other apprentice, so that they can recount their knowledge, and that helps with their communication skills as well. So that on the screen now is a rough overview of what a full apprenticeship program would look like. What it does is take account of the new Ofsted education inspection framework. So just to draw back the curtain slightly, as a provider previously, we would be very, very concerned about our quality measures. How many learners are starting our courses? How many of them are finishing? How many of them are finishing in the time frame that we set when they started? They'd be the things that Ofsted would really come and look at. And whilst they are still very important, there are a lot of other things that can affect that as well. So for example, if your programs are really detailed and you're putting lots of extra added value in, I mentioned the National Fluid Power Centre earlier, that's something that's a 5-day course, it's something that's important for that learner. If that then meant that they fell behind, does that mean the program's not good? I think probably you could argue one way or another. So the intent part is very important. The 3 parts of the Ofsted inspection, the new education inspection framework, are intent, implementation, and impact. So intent is what is the point of your delivery? Why do you deliver it? That for us is very much about, well, what do our employers say is important to them? So when we did the project management of this program, we actually got employers in, and there was about 15 people on the board, and they would tell us about the delivery. So we would present to them something like this and say, right, year 1, we want to do hand fitting, we want to do health and safety, we want to do communication skills, does that work? And some of the employers said, well, most of the employers said yes. There were some that were saying, actually, I need them to be doing machining really in year 1 as well, because that's something that they'll be doing in my workshop pretty much straight away, certainly once they've been trained. So, okay, we put that in there. The other thing that happened was a code of conduct. The employer felt that there was a bit of disconnect between their behaviour at college and their behaviour at work. So we wanted an overarching code of conduct, and that came out of a lot of the advisory boards. And the other thing was mentoring the employer to be able to pick up this additional responsibility. So that's your intent. And actually, the intent goes further than that. What's the starting point for this learner? If this learner's coming straight out of school and they've got absolutely no experience of engineering, it's right that they would start at the beginning. However, if I've maybe done some work experience over the summer at an engineering company, or I did a engineering related qualification at school or college, or I've just finished a level 2 qualification, then I don't want to be starting at the same point as someone that's just left school. So it's important that the provider can differentiate that. And you as an employer should be expecting to pay less for that training, because if they are taking bits out of the qualification, then they need to justify why they're still charging you full price. So for us, we send them to the National Fluid Power Centre in year 3 if it's appropriate for them, and that is a cost to us. So but we don't charge the employer for that. That's an added value as part of our training. The other thing is that we obviously have a lot of contractual paperwork. Anyone that's took an apprentice on in the last 2.5 years will probably have had to sign a few more bits of paperwork than they had to before. Our back office has struggled, I think it's probably fair to say. But then you have your on-program part, and that's the implementation. So how is it being delivered? How are you making sure that, for example, you have a global pandemic and people can't go to work anymore, that you're still keeping learners in learning? So we've switched to a lot of online learning. We do Google Classrooms. We can't do any work-based evidence because either our assessors are not welcome on site because there are potential contamination risks, or the site's not open. So how do you continue to make sure that that learner doesn't stagnate, and then we actually end up adding 6 months onto the end of their qualification? So we've had quite a few apprentices that have been furloughed, and in those instances, we're still setting them work. It's entirely up to them if they want to complete that work, and obviously the employer, if they furloughed them, doesn't really have a right to tell them to do it, because they're not working for them, or they're certainly been effectively temporarily laid off. But 99% of our employers and learners are engaging with us during this time. So if they're still working, then they're engaged. If they're not working, they're still attending Google Classrooms, they're still progressing their learning. Safeguarding is a massive piece as well. So it's not just about safeguarding in the context of, am I safe at college? Am I safe at work? It's also, am I safe at home? Are we recognizing and dealing with any vulnerable learners, people that are at risk of a variety of safeguarding concerns? So we know in Rotherham, child sexual exploitation is one of the big things that the safeguarding team works on there. Whereas in the workshop area, it's slightly different. It's more white supremacists and those sorts of things, because it's a more rural area. Whereas at Durham Valley, it's different again. So it's about having local safeguarding concerns, not just doing broad brush, this is safeguarding in this area. You obviously have maths and English. They will always be delivered as part of the qualification if the learner doesn't have it. And then you also have your offboarding, and that is the impact part. So I mentioned impact is part of the Ofsted framework. Impact is, what did it do? What did it do for the learner? What's their career progression opportunities afterwards? We know the vast majority of apprentices are kept on when they finish their study program. Do they then progress on to doing the next level? Do they do level 4? Are they offered an opportunity to progress? Some learners, when they finish a level 3, are absolutely done with education. At this point, they're probably 20 years old, been in full-time education for a while. And sometimes you need that break. So that doesn't mean that they're not going to progress in the future, but actually, did they get a pay rise? And I think that's one of the things that when Ofsted come into inspectors, they will want to see. So you train this many apprentices, what are those apprentices doing now? How many of those have progressed on to high level learning? How many of those have had a pay rise in the time they've been there, or had a promotion? And then obviously the endpoint assessment that I mentioned earlier. So the other thing is, most of you probably already know this, there's been a significant increase for most of the qualifications. You can see on the engineering technician, the equivalent as a framework was worth 9,000 to a provider, now worth 27,000. So my question to, if I was an employer, would be, well, what are you doing for that extra money? And that's 3 times more than it was worth. Now you've got an endpoint assessment to take out of that. So you could probably take 5,000 off for the endpoint assessment, but it's still more than double. So what are you doing for me now that you didn't do for me 2 years ago? I keep mentioning National Fluid Power Centre. That's one of the things we do. But in all of our areas, we've looked to have added value as part of our programme. And as an employer, I would be asking my provider, arm yourself with this information and say, well, if the qualification is worth 6, 7, more £1,000, what am I getting for my money? If you're a levy payer, you're paying every penny of that. And if you're not a levy payer, it's still coming down as government funding. So, they expect to see value for money. And that's why I was talking earlier, if the learner starts and they've already got some knowledge, it's important that the provider takes account of that prior knowledge and then either reduces the cost for you or puts something else in its place. If they're doing a level 2 qualification, maybe they want to put some level 3 content in there to stretch and challenge that learner. And that all needs to be done at the start of the program, because once they're on program, it's too late. We've locked in then what units they're going to study, the length of the program. It needs to be done front end so that we can agree, right, I'm not going to do this unit on welding because you've been a welder for 10 years, but what I'm going to do is put some additional lean management training in there for you, and that unit will be put as an added value. It has to map to the skills, knowledge, and behaviours. So it's not like we can just say, well, we'll get rid of that, but we'll put in, a CMI management qualification, because if it doesn't map to the standard, you can't claim funding for it. But as an FE college, and most providers will be in the same boat, you can flex to go from level 2 to level 3, and the good providers already do that. If I'm a really good level 2 learner, I want to be pulling level 3 content in, so I'm constantly being challenged. Otherwise, I'm going to get bored. I've included in here some of the things that can be included as part of off-the-job training. One of the things the apprenticeship standards did was massively change the way that employer training was counted in an apprenticeship. So an example we have is that in our one of our bigger clients, they do a lot of in-house training, and it's actually been mapped against the apprenticeship standard. so that we're not duplicating anything. Because if they do 2 weeks of machining training that's specifically linked to a manufacturer and is at a higher level, what's the point of being taught then at college something very basic? There are lesson plans that have to be covered, and you can't kind of get away from that. But there are elements where you can just put somebody straight in for an assessment rather than teach them all the content they already learned, turn them off from the course, and then put them in for the assignment. So there's some examples on there, and I would ask you to really talk to your training provider and say, actually, you know, work shadowing I do a lot of, and a day a week is the minimum amount of off-the-job training that's expected from people. And you might think, well, they go to college a day a week, or, you know, they go to a training facility a day a week. But the reality is, if it's an academic year like us, that's 36 weeks. So already you've still got the difference between 36 and 52. I'm not very good at maths, but I think it's about 12, 13, whatever. You've got that additional time already. So that has to be checked. And if the provider is found not to have done that off-the-job training, or demonstrated that 20% of the time was off the job, the whole lot gets pulled off them and you have to pay it all back. So it's in the provider's interest to check things. Also for yourself, if you want to, you know, I do a lot of this stuff already, then, you know, you need to talk to your provider about it. What can't be included? So stuff that's not linked to the skills, knowledge and behaviours in the standard. There's a couple of links at the end of the slides, and I'm sure Anna and Sean can send these out for you to check what the skills, knowledge and behaviours are. But I think it's important, because there might be stuff that you think you're doing that's training the apprentice that actually isn't linked to those. So a good example is always, we have guys that work on production lines. They think that forklift training, but it's not included. So you can't include a forklift license as part of your off the job because it doesn't link to the standard. Progress reviews also don't count. So when your assessor comes to see you every 4 to 6 weeks, part of that visit will not be included because it's a review. A review doesn't teach new skills and knowledge. It's just a review of what you've done. And anything that takes place outside the apprentice's paid hours. It's important to make that differentiation between their working pattern and paid hours. If they do 37 hours for you and you give them time off in lieu, but they work at the weekend and there's some training that takes place on that weekend, that will be included. It's where you say, just take that home and do it at home. That can't be included because they have to be paid for the training they undertake. So I started by saying too many providers looked at existing staff, and then I've left you a slide on there that says look at existing staff. But I think the other thing is look at mandatory and commercial training that you utilize as an employer, and ask the provider, can you include that as part of the training? They can only tell you no. Making sure that your managers have got ownership of the apprentices that come on board. We often find, especially with small businesses where, you know, potentially the owners are still operationally involved in the business, it's very difficult to give that time to an apprentice to give them efficient mentoring. We offer a one-day mentoring training program. I know a lot of providers offer that. I would absolutely recommend that you always send your staff on mentoring training, because it's only going to help them increase their own skills to work with you, but also that apprentice is then going to have a much better experience if they're being shown how to do things correctly, how to give effective feedback, how to make sure that you are drawing out communication skills from the apprentice, because a lot of the apprentices that come straight out of school struggle with communication, because it's not something the schools really massively push. You know, they'll talk to the friends, and actually, you know, they don't even talk to the parents. So it's important that there is that support from the employer to help draw out their communication skills. Final thing is just, you can give some of your levy. So if you don't think you're going to spend your levy, rather than let it go to waste, at the moment, I think over 2 billion has gone back to the Treasury. Absolutely guarantee that won't be put back into the apprenticeship supply chain. So you can gift it to some of your supply chain or to other people. Some links on there, so I'll send those out. It gives you a bit of an overview of the levy, but also all of the apprenticeship standards that are available. If you go onto the digital account, whether you're a levy payer or not, you can look for your apprenticeship training, and it will bring you up a list of the providers in that area, the success levels that they have, and the learner satisfaction as well. And I think that's one of the biggest things for us is speak to the learners, because they're the ones that will give you the most honest feedback. And I think that's it for me. So I'll hand you back to Sean and Anna.
Thanks, James. So we've got a question that's come up from David Orr. His question was, he just wanted, well, it's not a question so much, it was a statement. He wanted to point out that people don't learn at the same rate, and are there allowances made in the apprenticeships for that?
Yeah, definitely. If you go onto the apprenticeship website, you can see that there is a recommended length of stay. And I think it's right to have recommended length of stays because it allows the employer and the provider to have a rough idea of how long that program should last. But every single learner is different and they all have different starting points. So yeah, it's important that if someone already has a level 2 qualification as an example, that program is not 4 years. Equally, if that learner comes and they have an additional learning need, that the provider takes account of that and puts the additional support in place. Key for me is it's got to be done front end. And actually, if you do a robust advice and guidance session with that learner, you'll find out pretty quickly there is an additional learning need there. You need to increase the length of program and obviously increase or decrease the funding as appropriate.
Okay, and another one that's come from a meeting a while back from a colleague of mine, Peter Edwards, and at their meeting, the question arose that everybody seems to be offering level 3s in new standards. Is there any catering for anything lower than a level 3?
Yeah, that's a fair point, and it's quite clear that the government strategy is to amalgamate a lot of the level 2 qualifications into level 3 and basically have a longer, more expensive program that covers both level 2 and level 3. The difficulty is that maybe my ceiling is level 2, so I'll never, well, I can tell you now, I'll never do A-level maths, so I wouldn't be able to do an engineering technician qualification. That doesn't mean I wouldn't be an effective engineer. So there are some, we have the engineering operative at level 2, and there are others coming through all the time. But there are some examples where there is not a level 3. Business administration is a good example. There is only a level 3 qualification now, or will be once the framework's been withdrawn. And that will affect a lot of people because if you're coming out at 16, you have to have those GCSEs in place. You have to be able to pass the initial assessments. And if you don't, in some instances, there won't be an apprenticeship for you. In those instances, I think it's important the college has a robust work experience program that goes alongside the level 2 that they can do as a full-time program so that they are still picking up that work experience. So when they finish, they can progress onto a level 3.
Okay. And the only other one that probably I would like to ask is that the higher education, are there changes coming in at the higher levels?
Sorry, just broke up there, Sean. Just say that again for me.
Just wanted to ask, are there changes coming in at the higher levels? Yeah,
so at the moment we offer the higher engineering apprenticeship that has an embedded HNC. If you already have the HNC, you can do the HND instead. And then they do an MVQ level 4. That's being withdrawn and we're currently project managing into existence a process leader and a manufacturing technician level 4, which will both still have the HNC included within it. But in addition to that, there are a lot of level 5 qualifications and level 6 degree. I think there might be a level 7, but there's certainly the opportunity to get fully chartered through the apprenticeship program.
So would we be right in saying you could pretty much work your way through to a university equivalent qualification?
Yeah, definitely. And I think from our perspective, we've got a couple of university partners that we refer our level 4, 5 learners through to. And I know they've seen a big uptake. I think the benefit is that A, you're not getting saddled with the debt, but B, you are constantly picking up those practical skills to go alongside your university education as well.
Okay. I think is there one more here from David? I disagree with removing commercial training. We need our technical people to understand the market and competitive drivers and how important productivity is. So that's from David there. So I think it's a comment, and if anybody,
yeah, that's a fair comment.
If anybody wants to pick up on that, I don't know if you want to pick up on that, James, or
no, I think it's a fair comment, and you're absolutely right. You don't want to dilute the the quality that's provided by some of the commercial courses. I think it's probably a case of maybe doing both.